Got it. We're being recorded. Fantastic. Well, I'm going to get started with today's University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Urban Planning Innovative Cities lecture. My name is Bob Schneider. I'm a professor of urban planning and a co-chair of our department, along with Carolyn Eswine. I'll be introducing today's speaker. But before we get started, I want to do our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge in Milwaukee that we are on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland along the southwest shores of Michigamme, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnic rivers meet, and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. We feel it's important as planners who are working to create more equitable communities that we share resources to deepen your knowledge and connection with Indigenous communities. We encourage everyone to review the map shown on the screen here, find the territories and languages in the areas where you live and work. Again, welcome to our Innovative Cities lecture series. Just so you know, our next Innovative Cities lecture will be on April 17th. It'll have Hannah Love of the Brookings Institution speaking on equity and placemaking. And we will also be having our Charles Cosier Memorial Lecture on April 23rd here in person at the School of Architecture and Urban Planning on campus here at UWM. And we'll hear from leaders of the American Planning Association talking about emerging trends in planning at that. Today, we'll be talking about resilient transportation connections, and we are glad to be joined by Dr. Tabitha Combs. She's a research associate with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. As a colleague in my field, I've known Tab for well over a decade. She's one of the leading scholars in working towards more sustainable and equitable transportation systems. Today, Tab will present her research on transportation connections in the context of pandemic-related mobility responses, including practices cities should continue today. Audience, Tab will be presenting for the next 40 or so minutes, and then we'll open up the Q&A. So please post your comments and questions in the chat during her presentation. Welcome, Tab. I'll turn it over to you for the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Bob. I'm really happy to be here virtually speaking with y'all today. So I'm speaking about research that I've done since the beginning of the pandemic, trying to understand what lessons the COVID pandemic has for active mobility, for sustainability, and for resilience. Resilient with respect to individuals and communities and how people adapt and thrive in a changing world. Before I jump into that though, I want to share with you my working definition of resilience, because I know we may all be coming from different places and thinking about this word in different ways. So I want to make sure that you all understand where I'm coming from with resilience. So to me, resilience is it's the capacity that's embedded within people, within communities, and with organizations to withstand, adapt, and emerge from disruptions stronger than they were before. There are three critical dimensions to resilience that bear on transportation. How individuals, institutions, and societies adapt to a changing mobility landscape, how physical, social, and policy facets of transportation systems create vulnerability or resilience at individual and community levels, and how transportation systems build capacity to meet societal needs during and after disruptions. And disruptions can happen at any scale, from a flat tire to an individual level disruption to a worldwide pandemic. And they can happen at any speed, from, say, global fuel shortages, which take a while to unfold, to saliently thinking about the tragedy in Maryland yesterday, to bridge collapses, things that can happen in an instant, in the blink of an eye. I'm going to talk today about resilience in the context of a global disruption that I'm sure we're all pretty sick of by now, and maybe some of us sick from, so COVID-19. We'll start with how cities responded to the rapid changes in transportation demand that was brought on by COVID. And then I'm going to present a summary of findings from research I've led and collaborated on in the 4 years since the start of the pandemic to document and understand the impacts of those responses. And then I'll end with a discussion of the implications of COVID streets experiences for building resilience in and through transportation. So during the pandemic, particularly during the early days of the pandemic, cities around the world faced dramatic changes in demand for public space. As schools and businesses shut down and those who could work remotely stayed home, the need for safe outdoor spaces for walking, biking, and engaging in commerce surged. Thousands of cities responded by taking road space away from cars and giving it over to other uses. These changes ushered in a dramatic shift in how cities think about and allocate space for people who walk, who bike, who roll. Creating space in public roadways for uses other than driving has never been easy. Normally, this takes years, if not decades, just to get simple things like sidewalks, curb cuts, other sorts of really minor facilities installed. But during the early months of the COVID pandemic, cities seem to be able to create facilities much grander than this practically overnight. So something monumental shifted in the way the transportation profession, city leaders, and the public thought about and valued public roadway space. The state of mobility practice, so how we plan, design, install, maintain our transportation infrastructure and systems is badly overdue for change, right? The climate, the economic, the social costs of a transportation system that's built around cars are very well documented, but changing our systems to deprioritize cars has proven incredibly challenging. But COVID did change things. The pandemic underscored longstanding inequities in our current approaches to transportation planning, highlighted the lack of resilience in the mobility systems we've built, and in some cases gave people a glimpse of what was possible on city streets. These, in some cases, overnight responses to the pandemic have also raised some critical questions about the transportation sector's readiness to deal with disruptions and disasters, and to do so in a way that builds resilience, justice, and sustainability. I began tracking cities' transportation-related responses to COVID in March of 2020, so like 4 years ago, almost to the day. It started out as a social media-based crowdsourcing effort that was really just my way of coping with the stress of the pandemic. But with help from the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center and the New Urban Mobility Alliance, this effort evolved into what's now called the Shifting Streets COVID Mobility Database. This database has documented efforts to enact street space changes in direct response to the pandemic in more than 1,500 cities around the world. These changes include things like reallocating curb space to create pop-up bike lanes, filtering non-local traffic off of neighborhood streets, closing streets down entirely to vehicle traffic to allow for recreation and play, installing traffic calming to create shared spaces, and permitting businesses to use street space for outdoor dining and commerce. The pace of deployment of these responses was breathtaking. We had been used to waiting years, sometimes decades, for pedestrian and bicycle projects, and now we are measuring their rollouts in terms of weeks and days. And the physical changes that cities made are significant, but the changes in processes that enabled and shaped these changes are of critical interest to planning, and I believe hold the keys to integrating resilience into transportation planning. So sudden shocks open windows of opportunity for catalyzing change. The transportation field has been through a bunch of shocks, though, from natural disasters such as hurricanes and earthquakes where people have to evacuate, where we need to rebuild roads, to things like transit strikes and, again, bridge collapses. Experts and advocates have been calling for changes to the transportation field's conventional approach to building safe, multimodal, resilient streets for decades, but none of the well-documented crises that were already on the table, not climate change, not the 40,000 deaths that happen on our roads every year, not the vast amounts of debt that households go into to maintain the card. None of those managed to move the needle on transportation practices the way the pandemic has. So the conditions that were brought about by COVID seem to provide a necessary shock to make changes happen. So this is truly a really critical moment for us to understand what shaped decisions behind the thousands of COVID streets efforts that took place around the world. And hopefully the experiences from those efforts can shape transportation planning practices to support a more resilient and sustainable future. In 2021, my colleague, Carlos Pardo, and I published a research agenda that lays out critical lines of inquiry for understanding the pandemic's impacts on transportation, mobility, justice, and resilience. Some of the questions we lay out are: how did existing plans and planning processes enable and shape local COVID streets programs? To what extent were community engagement and mobility justice concerns integrated into COVID streets programs? And how did those factors shape the distribution of costs and benefits of those programs? And how can the lessons from COVID experiences be used to inform new best practices for transportation planning? Practices that build household, community, and societal resilience in the face of future disruptions. In the past 4 years, we've learned a lot about these research questions. So I want to give you the high-level summary of findings from some of the projects that I've been working on, and then dive into some details on our latest work, which is focused specifically on building capacity for resilience in transportation planning based on lessons that cities have learned from COVID. So first, the high-level summary, and that's that the transportation planning field is evolving. Cities' experiences planning and implementing COVID streets generated new ways of thinking about streets. This includes new philosophies about street space and a growing appetite for experimentation, for creativity, and crucially for sped up implementation timelines. And this new thinking is already translating into new codes and regulations and new standards for designs and materials in many cities. We've also seen the rise of on-the-fly, or we call in situ testing of new designs. So these were essentially pilots, even if they weren't really intended as such, but they emerged as a tool for demonstrating new designs and for conducting public engagement about those new designs while they were in place. And when planners were able to adapt their designs based on the feedback from that engagement in real time, they began to develop stronger and more open relationships with the communities they were working with. The transportation field is also learning. The professionals we've spoken with in the course of our research learned that the rapid response approach didn't always work. Some streets, some situations are just better suited for it than others. And many of the challenges that communities faced need more systemic solutions than a temporary design change can provide. And finally, cities learned that planning matters. In particular, having a relevant plan in place to guide crisis response planning and engagement processes, and having data collection and evaluation programs set out in advance to support those plans. These were elements that few cities had in place, but nearly all of the planners we've spoken with recognize in retrospect would have vastly improved their ability to respond to the challenges presented by the pandemic. As a result, transportation professionals and city leaders are looking for planning frameworks to guide their cities through and beyond future disruptions now. And the upshot of all of this is that there is now a huge appetite in the transportation planning community for guidance on using transportation plans, using transportation processes, and infrastructure to build resilience in the face of an increasingly uncertain future. Okay, so now for the deep dive. How can the lessons we're learning from cities' COVID streets projects shape development of that new framework for integrating resilience into transportation planning? So my colleagues, so again, Carlos Pardo, who is in Bogota, Colombia, and Lindsay Oliere at the University of Arizona, we tackled this question through a review of COVID streets responses in 28 cities around the world. We sought to identify the motivations driving cities' actions in response to changing demands for street space, and their approaches to planning and implementing those actions, and then the extent to which those approaches were influenced by the motivations that trigger them. So what I'm presenting now is based on a paper that Carlos and Lindsay and I published a couple of months ago in Transport Reviews called The Why and How of COVID Streets, a city-level review of research into planning motivations and approaches during a crisis. And I'll make sure and share a reference to that paper at the end of the presentation if Blythe hasn't already found it, to put it in the chat. All right, so here's what we found. Our analysis yielded 4 main kinds of motivations behind cities' decisions to enact COVID streets responses. The first 3 are all geared toward addressing immediate threats posed by the pandemic. So reducing the risk of COVID-19 transmission, mitigating the secondary impacts of lockdowns and closures, and accommodating new demand for walking, biking, and other outdoor activities that were induced by the pandemic. The 4th motivation we identified, we called seizing the opportunity to advance pre-pandemic plans or objectives. And I'll talk a little bit about what each of these motivations mean. So early in the pandemic, there was an immediate focus on reducing the risk of virus transmission. Interest in walking and biking as alternatives to public transit and to more crowded forms of recreation grew really early in the pandemic. Cities recognized that existing facilities were inadequate, particularly along key transportation corridors. And so they set about creating new and typically temporary facilities for walking and biking, getting people places within existing rights of way. In our 28 city study, we saw risk reduction as an explicit motivation for action, typically expressed by very high-level public officials in 11 of the 28 cities. As the pandemic continued, it became clear that the lockdowns, the closures, all the other efforts to reduce viral transmission were exacerbating existing inequalities, decreasing access to recreation, decreasing opportunities for physical activity, and just generally complicating efforts to address the pandemic itself. Cities recognize the need to respond to these sort of synergistic or syndemic concerns of COVID, and providing space for active mobility and outdoor commerce emerged as a logical way to do that. Concerned over mitigating these secondary impacts also motivated responses in 11 of the 28 cities. Some of the responses, though, were driven simply by a recognition that more people were walking and biking on city streets than ever before, and those people were demanding better and safer places to do it. We found this idea of accommodating increased demand for walking and biking as an explicit motivation for action in 6 of our 28 cities. And then to the opportunism one, some city leaders recognized that the increased demand for walking and biking facilities, coupled with reductions in motor vehicle traffic, they saw this both as a mandate and an opportunity to implement pre-existing active transportation plans or agendas, and to experiment with new ideas about multimodal street design. Seizing the opportunity presented by the pandemic to advance pre-pandemic planned goals or agendas was identified as a motivation in 21 of our 28 cities, so the full 3/4 of them. We also identified 4 different overall ways that cities approached planning and implementing their COVID streets responses. So first was motivations, and now this is the approaches that they take to roll out their responses. And these different approaches were opportunism, was a little bit different from the motivation, crisis reaction, an approach that was centered on the recognition that normal or business as usual conditions were also a crisis, and then one that we called agility. And again, I'll go into all of those as well. So opportunism as an approach to COVID streets is characterized by a distinctly top-down planning process with very limited public engagement, and is driven by strong political factors. Actions or responses, the COVID streets changes were clearly aligned with existing plans or with stated policy goals, and cities that followed this approach tended to have influential ped bike advocacy organizations in place, with robust political supports for active transportation. Descriptions of these cities' responses were strongly characterized by opportunity language, with keywords like fast track and build out in their descriptions of their actions. Opportunism was the lead approach to COVID streets responses in 7 of our 28 cities. An example of the opportunism approach is in the Friedrichshain-Kreuzberg district in Berlin. So in 2016, Berlin drafted a mobility act, or passed a mobility act, that prompted the government of the district, of Friedrichs-Kreuzberg district, to develop a bike facility plan and increase staff capacity to implement the plan. So this made the district very well positioned to act when the pandemic hit because they already were staffed up, and enabled them to implement pop-up bike lanes along corridors that had been identified in their plan. So responses by cities that followed the crisis reaction approach were characterized by a "we have to do something" attitude. This was typically noted by frequent use of terms like emergency, urgency, or crisis. And these responses also tended to be strongly top-down. Developing a COVID-specific response was a significant priority for crisis reaction cities. Sometimes cities seemed to be making it up as they went along, sort of in a knee-jerk reaction, but others were a bit more strategic about it, like Mexico City, whose COVID response was guided by an emergency bikeway plan the city had drawn up in response to a gas shortage in 2019, so 1 year before. And this was the most common approach we saw in our data. We identified this in 11 cities. Cities in the normal or pre-pandemic conditions were also a crisis approach, acknowledged that the pandemic exposed longstanding problems, and they appeared to treat the pandemic as a moment of reckoning to address those problems. So there was a strong sense, of we do need to do something. Let's take this opportunity to address these longstanding problems at the same time. These cities tended to be slower to implement changes, and there was a heavy emphasis on engaging the public and identifying, designing, and deploying these cities' responses. Cities that were aligned with the normal was also a crisis approach, exhibited an emphasis on procedural factors, adhering to established decision support mechanisms to inform the development of their responses. One of the normal was also a crisis cities is Tucson, where city leaders piloted 3 slow streets in May of 2020. And then they spent the next several months establishing and implementing a public input process that included things like hiring street ambassadors. They hired 45 street ambassadors to lead an engagement process, to gather feedback from the pilots, and then inform design of a more robust citywide program that addressed a lot of other ongoing problems that people had expressed about mobility in Tucson. And then the final approach that we identified, it's characterized by this newfound tolerance for experimentation. So this is agility, and it's a sense that the pandemic's urgency allowed for bolder, more innovative, more responsive actions. Only a few cities that we looked at fell solidly within the agility approach, but the predominant theme in those cities was that city staff felt encouraged by the urgency of the pandemic to propose and deploy creative new ideas. That came through really strongly in those cities. The agility approach is top down, but it's typically not led, at the very top by city leaders, but by transportation planning staff. who were bolstered by emergency powers and also by a sense of togetherness that was inspired by the pandemic. Through an agility approach, the town of Salta in Argentina, which is already a mountain biking mecca, was able to expand its bike and pedestrian network through low-cost experimental designs. Was thanks to the confluence of three factors: an existing sustainable mobility culture, a history of change taking place through disruptive processes, and an emboldened spirit prompted by the urgency of the pandemic. Okay, I'm just going to check the chat real quick to see if any questions for me in here. Oh, nope. Okay. So on to the last question that we tackled, to what extent were cities' approaches to planning and implementing their COVID streets projects influenced by the motivations that triggered them? And there were a few relationships that jumped out at us. So in the 7 cities that took an opportunism approach, their actions were driven almost exclusively by that seize the opportunity motivation. Risk reduction and meeting new demands also appear here with opportunism, but every city with an opportunism approach had to seize the opportunity motivation. So, okay, not terribly earth-shattering until you think about the fact that that seize the opportunity motivation was also present in 6 of the 11 crisis reaction cities. Half of the normal was also a crisis cities, and both of the agility cities. So what this means is that while there are obvious logical connections between opportunism as an approach to planning and opportunism as a motivation for planning, responses that were driven by a desire to capitalize on the opportunity presented by the pandemic need not have been decided, planned, or implemented in an opportunistic manner. So again, just because you have an opportunistic motivation doesn't mean that your approach to acting on that motivation is necessarily going to be opportunistic. The most common approach, again, that we saw was the crisis reaction one. And this one was connected to and triggered by all 4 of the motivations as well. And to me, the takeaway is that any motivation for planning, whether it's to respond to the immediate impacts of the pandemic or to capitalize on the opportunity the pandemic presented, can lead into a planning approach that's shaped primarily by top-down crisis-oriented actions. So only 4 cities fit the normal was also a crisis approach, and only 2 aligned with agility. So I'm not going to really draw a lot of conclusions about the relationships with motivations, but these 2 are pretty important. So we're going to come back to them in just a slide or 2. All right, so what does this mean for this idea of building resilience through and in transportation? Okay, so I told you we're going to come back to normal as a crisis and agility. Despite making a fairly poor showing in our review, both of these approaches, so normal with also a crisis and agility, had really important implications for resilience. The recognition that responses to the pandemic should have also addressed other challenges reflects an important point for resilience, which is that cities should come out stronger, more just, and more able to adapt to not only everyday life, but also to major upheavals after disruption. And the concepts around the agility approach hold a key lesson for post-pandemic planning practices. And that's that experimentation with real-time feedback and adaptation is sometimes preferable to more conventional models of transportation planning. Most of the cities we've studied so far have noted the importance of being able to experiment, to conduct these in situ analyses and fix mistakes in real time as a critical post-pandemic planning practice. And as I said at the start, one of the goals of resilience planning is for communities to be able to withstand and emerge from disruption stronger than they went into them. But only a handful of cities' COVID responses aligned with approaches that seem to support that goal, which supports, the previous findings that we've seen that many cities, despite their very swift actions, really weren't prepared to respond to the pandemic with resilience building solutions. So based on that, we put forth the coping versus catalyzing framework as a way to help the transportation field better prepare for future disruptions. This framework posits that resilience building during and after a disruption is like a dance between coping with the impacts of the disruption and leveraging these impacts as a catalyst for long-term change. So on the coping side, disruptions pose urgent problems that need immediate and specific responses. Three of the motivations we saw, so reducing risks, mitigating impact, and accommodating demand, they're coping motivations. And the approaches of crisis reaction, normal was also a crisis, and agility were also aligned with coping because their focus was on actions that meet immediate needs. Catalyzing occurred when cities used the policy window that was opened by the pandemic to advance pre-pandemic agendas through the seize the opportunity motivation and the opportunism approach. So the state of mobility practice has stagnated on an unsustainable model of prioritizing car travel over all other modes, regardless of the economic, safety, equity, climate consequences. And this policy window that the pandemic opened up provided the shock needed to shake up transportation planning practices. But the sheer prevalence of top-down opportunistic motivations and approaches that we've seen raises a critical question, and that's, to what extent did the opportunity presented by the pandemic compete with efforts to address the immediate concerns of the pandemic, and for whom? So recall that at the onset of the pandemic, at least in the US, but also around the world, coincided with a widespread recognition that racial and class violence that was playing out in streets were exacerbated by the stress of the pandemic. COVID Streets programs that failed to address this were inherently inequitable and unsustainable, and they undermined the very resilience they should have been building. Carl Kim provides an anecdote from Oakland, California, that illustrates the potential tension between opportunistic or catalyzing and coping responses. He described the mixed reception of Oakland's 21 miles of partial street closures that were in line with an existing plan by quoting a city official. It says, early in the pandemic, a number of slow streets were wildly successful for people to socially distance and recreate in their neighborhoods. We also got pushback in some neighborhoods where slow streets were seen as a needless complication on top of all the challenges created by the pandemic. This split occurred largely along lines of class and race. Following the feedback received from community engagement, the city of Oakland developed its Essential Places program, which was meant to enhance pedestrian safety near critical destinations in these neighborhoods. And I present this example because it serves as a cautionary lesson. The catalyzing approach alone may fail to respond to the urgent needs posed by a disruption and could contribute to inequities, especially when vulnerable populations are also disproportionately impacted by that disruption. And this cautionary tale leads directly into my first recommendation, which is that in the face of future disruptions, cities really seek a balanced approach that includes elements of all of the approaches we identified to address specific impacts caused by the disruption and to build resilience post-disruption. Develop a process that fosters agility, but not at the expense of procedural and epistemic justice. Take advantage of policy windows, but do so in accordance with established community-engaged decision-making protocols. And the second recommendation for cities is to plan. Good mobility plans based on extensive and open public engagement processes often serve as a launch pad for cities' responses to COVID. It seems obvious, I know, but so many cities simply did not have plans that effectively supported their COVID responses or were available to them to be used to guide their COVID responses. The experiences gained by cities as they attempted to lessen the impacts of the pandemic, regardless of their motivations or approaches, hold lessons that are critical to mitigating the effects of future crises. There are countless stories waiting to be told. Much more work is needed from the research community and from the practice community to elicit and document these stories. The reasons for action, the planning and decision-making processes, the outcomes, the lessons learned. This is critical data, and we really need it so we can address theory-building research questions. Things like, is it useful to consider a more deliberate and circumspect approach during an unfolding crisis? In a crisis, how can cities become more flexible in the development and implementation of responses while staying accountable to residents' concerns? And under what circumstances and preconditions can a response be implemented quickly, equitably, and sustainably? And finally, planning scholars and practitioners really need to come together to develop a framework for integrating resilience and adaptability into transportation plans and processes. The appetite for doing this is certainly here right now, but the transportation sector has really been lagging both in its understanding and implementation of resilience principles beyond basic emergency response. We could draw lessons from the public health and injury prevention fields here. And there really are some striking principles between things like safe systems, Vision Zero, and things like that, and resilience that's embedded within transportation. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions, to talk about this more. I promised a slide showing some of the papers and studies that I cited here. So there you go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Combs. That was fantastic. I think a general public perception of some of the COVID changes to streets might have been like, well, there's just our local government's experimenting with something, and there wasn't much more thought given to it. But you've given it such a thoughtful academic framework that's easy to understand some of those motivations behind why the agencies were doing what they were doing. So it's really important work. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. I have a couple of questions in the chat that I'll start with, and then we'll probably get some more as we go along. The first one was a really good one related to people with disabilities. And if your research found, what it found in particular with cities learning to accommodate people with disabilities through these street changes.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question, and it's something that cities really did struggle with early on, particularly when people were in that crisis mode. We kind of got tunnel vision. We're like, okay, so here is the thing we need to deal with now. And I don't say that to bust on the cities that were doing this. God knows they had enough things to be panicking about at the moment. But that urgency did keep a lot of cities from thinking, about accessibility, about ADA requirements, and a lot of the things that they implemented, particularly with respect to outdoor dining and outdoor commerce, were very inaccessible. And there, I mean, cities got quite a bit of feedback about that, and sometimes the fixes were actually fairly simple. They just needed to get out of that COVID is the crisis mentality. And remember, yes, there are also other things that we need to do and things that we haven't done well in the past. And so, there were some places that did manage to deal with those things all together. But most of the places, that at least acted early on had a hard time remembering to continue the project that they had been working on, the goals that they'd been working towards, while also dealing with the crisis.
Follow up to that, what would you say to a criticism that's sometimes raised in terms of people having a street closed to through traffic and that potentially making it the system less accessible for people with disabilities or other people who are relying on motorized transit to get around.
Cities went about this in a lot of different ways. The some of the ones that we saw most commonly were they came through a number of different names. We ended up calling them partially closed streets. Sometimes they were called shared streets, sometimes they were called filtered streets. The whole idea though was to try and reduce the motor vehicle traffic on streets. They ended up being probably some of the most popular interventions that happened in the US because they were some of the most simple ones to pull off. But yeah, there was some pushback, and a lot of cities did roll them back. We saw that less outside the U.S. It's sort of a uniquely U.S. thing to do. Also, a little bit of it coming along in the U.K. later. Most of the rest of the world, though, focused on different sorts of interventions.
The slower street can also be great for people with disabilities itself. So, so another question had to do with essentially your point about policy windows and seizing the opportunity. Can you give a few more examples of shocks other than COVID that could potentially be used to create that mindset within a city? Are there ones that you've thought about that you say, hey, this is a way that we need to inspire that sort of quick thinking?
We don't have a lot of good contemporary examples. The best parallel that I'm aware of is during the fuel crisis of the 1970s, when fuel was really expensive and people started thinking, with help and encouragement from President Carter, about public transit, about walking and biking. That's the only real parallel. We've had tons of other small scale shocks that are like citywide, that are very shocking events, very, very massive disruptions within cities, but they haven't really changed the status quo. When there was the bridge fire in LA last fall, there was a lot of talk early on about how are we going to adapt? What are we going to do differently because this interstate is shut down? As soon as that interstate reopened in record time, all of that talk dissipated. And so I think it does sort of take both the suddenness and scale of something like the pandemic, but also has to be drawn out over time. So people can't just wait it out. Definitely not advocating for anything like that to happen. But what I think the takeaway here is that we've seen this shock that came on very suddenly, the pandemic. Let's also recognize the crises that are taking a long time, that we are asking people to adapt on the fly. We're just not doing it in as visible a way, like climate change being one for sure. It's much, much longer impacts, much greater impacts, I think. But it's not as shocking in a global scale. And so we need to think about how do we make these changes without having to have that really abrupt, really traumatic shock.
Another question is related to probably a follow-on to the research you presented, but essentially how often and why and when do these types of essentially temporary treatments convert into more permanent infrastructure and programming type changes? Have you seen some evidence of that? And can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so that has definitely happened in a lot of places. It's been hard to track that information. Early on in the pandemic, everybody was really excited to share the cool things that their cities did. But then tracking, the evolution and the resolution of those has been a little bit more challenging. But we do know from interviews with planners in a couple dozen cities around the U.S. That it actually happened quite a bit. That the temporary interventions were converted in some way to permanent. Maybe they were adapted. It was about 3/4 of the cities where we've spoken to people to see what's happened. Our sample is a little bit biased because it's easier to speak to people about these things in cities that were really supportive of them. It's harder to find people who want to talk about cities or talk about their programs that their cities shut down. So we do have a little bit of bias towards places that where there was a lot of public support for what they were doing. But I think what is as important a thing to track is the policies and the thought processes that came about through these implementations. So yes, it's very cool that an intervention was so popular that it became permanent. But I also want to know, how have your practices changed because of that? What new policies and what new plans are in place because of that? Because that's how we get these long-term, the sustained change to practice.
Exactly. That's the systems change. Thanks for answering that one. We have a great one also from Chicago, one of our alumni there. We've seen an increased demand for more transit, bicycle, and pedestrian facilities around emergency migrant housing. And so it was a shock not only to the affordable housing structures, but the transportation network. And he's suggesting we're not doing both and not doing enough in both respects. Did you get into any broader context issues besides just sort of the street redesign, but also into housing, economic development, those sorts of things, especially with housing in this question?
It's something that we're trying to get into to see what the ramifications were, because we know that housing, basically all of the urban challenges that we've dealt with in isolation in the past came together during the pandemic and forced the planning community to grapple with the things that we've been hiding from, that transportation is a housing issue, that housing is an access to opportunity issue, that economic development is a transportation issue, that all of these are public health issues, and they're all wrapped in a policing and enforcement culture. And so while we haven't looked specifically at housing, we've seen where cities are talking about the fact that the places where they're implementing or where they have implemented changes to their streetscape do not necessarily align with the places where people have other needs. Some of the cities talked about, they looked at their equity maps, they looked at their access to opportunity and housing affordability maps, and did try and line these interventions up, but most cities did not, and they realized after the fact, wow, the streets that are easiest to convert, the streets that are most adaptable and that can foster the most resilience are not in the places where people have the most need for them. And it's sort of, a fundamental truth of transportation planning in general, but it smacked us in the face during the pandemic.
Sure. Interesting question here about the approach in terms of the experiments being from the angle of improving non-car options to reduce respiratory impacts and thus the impacts of COVID. So trying to reduce automobile emissions that lead to other respiratory problems. Was that discussed at all among these 28 cities?
It really wasn't. We did see a recognition that there were other challenges with car dependence that could exacerbate the pandemic. Physical inactivity being a big one. We know that during the early stages of the pandemic, when everybody was staying home, we know that air quality improved dramatically, but there's not a single city in which we saw that listed explicitly as a motivation for keeping people out of, giving them alternatives to driving. I mean, it does seem like it should have been a logical connection, right? But again, I think it was like the period in which people weren't driving coincided with the period in which we had that tunnel vision on reduce virus transmission, do whatever it takes. And so we weren't thinking about it systemically yet.
Feel free to continue adding questions in the chat. I have one that I don't think has been addressed directly yet. This may go beyond the 28 cities that you studied in particular, but I was curious about your broader database and what you might have seen from small cities, small towns, villages, and even suburbs. Were there places that tried some of these experimental treatments and really redefined their streets that aren't sort of the classic large cities? And what happened there?
Yeah, we saw cities of all different sizes. We saw small towns, and again, up to cities, the size of New York City. And there's no rhyme or reason. Some massive cities were extremely experimental, and some small towns were very rigid. Some small towns that wanted to experiment found they couldn't do so because they didn't have access to the resources that would enable them to do so. The temporary materials are cheap, for sure, but in the beginning of the pandemic, they were very hard to come by, and the staff power to put them out and maintain them was hard to come by. So we saw some cities, some small towns that were very well positioned to act in innovative ways, and we saw some cities that major cities that did some innovative stuff. And I have tried slicing and dicing our 1,500 cities every way I can, and the only patterns I've been able to find are continental patterns. The U.S. was more interested in not allowing cars on streets where pedestrians and bicyclists were already there, because we're very focused on liability. In Europe, there was much more of an emphasis on sharing space and putting in pop-up bike lanes and things like that, with whatever materials people had on hand. In Latin America, we saw the rapid imposition of very robust infrastructure because they had the manpower. They tend to have the manpower to do that. And those are really the only patterns that we are able to see, was these sort of broad sweeping continental patterns.
One other question I was curious about is what I would consider backsliding from the perspective of trying to create more active and safer streets. You mentioned a really good example from Oakland in resistance to certain slow street implementation, and there was a clear reason behind that, and you illustrated that clearly. Are there other examples of communities that saw some significant backlash to what they did, and are there any other lessons that we can take from that?
Yeah, I think one of the examples that happened sort of early on in the pandemic, it's Oakland is like trotted out often as an example. It's like, we did something, oh, you don't like it, okay, we're going to keep trying until we figure out what it is you want. A lot of cities were like, we did something, you don't like it, okay, we'll go away. And in Oakland, Warren Logan ran that program, and he talks about how they're like, well, I can't go away because that's like shirking my responsibility. I have to figure out what the community actually needs. So that they're held up as an example a lot. But other cities that had their programs challenged, a big example is Berlin. Berlin rolled out, I can't even remember how many, like 76 miles of pop-up bike lanes. I mean, an extraordinary amount of pop-up bike lanes. And people pushed back, and it went to court, whatever the equivalent of their state or regional Supreme Court. And they upheld it in court. They're like, no, this is within the powers. Yeah, a good example of where it was challenged and a court found it to be lawful. I don't know that it's been taken, like these things have been taken to court in the US ever. People are just like, yeah, we don't like it, take it away. Or we don't like it, let's talk about something we might actually like. I mean, we're seeing some examples of those. I do not have them. I do not have the names of the towns popping in my head right now, but we've talked to several people who told us that residents were like, this wasn't your best move. But now that we're talking, let's talk about what we can do better. So a little bit of backsliding, but a little bit of like side slipping as well.
I'm going to ask one more question, but before I do that and we lead towards the end here, I want to remind everybody about our the post-lecture survey that Blythe put into the chat, and then our upcoming lectures. Make sure to register for those Innovative Cities on April 17th, and then our Causer lecture here on campus on April 23rd. Also, many thanks to Blythe for doing a great job as always for finding the links and providing them in real time as we talk. So my last question is just, we have a number of practitioners who work in community agencies from transportation to housing to community development who are on the call today. And I guess what would your advice to them be as they look forward and think about what to do in planning for whether it's a pandemic or whether it's just revisiting how their streets look and doing temporary treatments? What would your advice to them be, given what you've found?
So one of the best interviews we had and most informative was in Milwaukee with a planner in Milwaukee, who talked about data collection procedures. Figure out ahead of time what data you might need to guide a response to any sort of disruption in the future. Think very broadly about your data needs, and set up the programs for gathering that data. Make sure you know who is staffed to collect the data. Make sure you know how you're going to assess the data that you receive to guide you as you are rolling out responses to future crises. So like data systems, absolutely. And the other one is get comfortable with trying things and asking people for feedback on the fly. That was the single most common thing that cities talked about as being keys to their success is not just rolling something out and walking away, but rolling out an intervention with public engagement as an integral part of that intervention. And being ready and responsive to making tweaks on the fly to really fine tune it. And that's one of the things I hope is going to emerge as a new best practice for planning is we no longer have to have everything planned out before we take action. And we no longer have to make our actions be permanent. Try things, do small things, do them well, ask for feedback. Don't be afraid to adapt them if the feedback you get suggests that's what you should do.
That is such a great point, and definitely a shout out to our Department of Public Works, our Department of City Development here in Milwaukee, who are doing those things. Rapid implementation projects we've seen in the last 2 years following the pandemic, they are collecting data along with those projects and doing exactly what I think they learned through the pandemic and talked with you about. So it's fantastic that we can be an example. Certainly there's work to be done. I'm sure if you ask the staff here, they'll say there's more that we can do, but it's progress towards changing that institutional system that we have for delivering these projects. So Tab, Dr. Coombs, totally appreciate you presenting to us today, sharing your insights, and thanks for all the work that you've done in this area to help move our profession forward in thinking about these types of experimental treatments. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody who provided comments in the chat. Thanks again for joining us today. We'll end there. Thanks, Tab.
Thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
All right, have a good one.